Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. The chapel windows are fogged with autumn mist as Margaret sits alone in the front row, draped in black, her hands clasped. In her lap, trembling slightly as she listens to the soft echo of the choir singing old hymns that meant everything to her, and meant nothing to the absent son and daughter-in-law, she hoped would be beside her today. She glances at the empty seats reserved for them, her heart pinching with every labored breath of the preacher who speaks of remembrance, love, and loss, yet the texture of his words feels hollow without their presence. The pews behind her fill with friends, neighbors, distant cousins, people who nod consolingly as they pass the polished wooden casket carrying her Thomas, but none of them are Daniel or Claire. The floral tributes blaze with color, lilies, chrysanthemums, but there is a gap where she'd pictured two bouquets from her son. Her mind races with memories of Daniel as a child chasing his father through their garden, laughing muddy shoes and sunlit afternoons, then the subtle shifts, the cold silences, the phone calls that went unanswered. Until now she closes her eyes briefly to stave off tears, to hold something of him inside her before grief overtakes her. Voice cracks when she recites the Lord's Prayer, stitching together her faith and her sorrow in the same breath, struggling to believe that this ceremony that holds so much dignity to her represents something trivial. To those she loves most, the echo of Daniel's words, reported by a guest, rings in her ears. "You called it a trivial event," he had said once. Not worth attending, as though her husband's life, his kindness, his laughter were mere inconveniences. In the march of something bigger than love, she opens her eyes, sees the assembled faces turning to her, offering tissue, hands a murmured condolence. But no, "I'm sorry" from Daniel, no embrace from Claire, no arrival that would reach across the distance they have carved between. Margaret remembers the scent of sun-warmed pine and fresh grass when she thinks back to the early days, back when Daniel was still a boy and Thomas still laughed with the kind of joy that filled a room without trying, and they lived in a modest house with cracked steps and mismatched plates, but love in every corner. She sees Daniel's small hand gripping Thomas's thumb in old photographs she keeps in a box beneath her bed, now brittle with age and corners curling, and when she holds them the warmth almost returns for a moment. She remembers Thomas teaching Daniel to ride a bike, his voice calm, never raised. Even when Daniel fell and scraped his knees, Thomas knelt beside him, brushing off dirt, telling him that getting up is what mattered, not falling, and she wonders now if Daniel ever remembers that, or if it was erased by the years that came after, the wide years when distance crept in unnoticed like dust behind the curtains. And by the time Margaret noticed it, Daniel had already changed, already begun retreating into himself, and more time was spent outside the home. First college, then a city job, then a sleek apartment. Claire came next, sharp suits, sharp words, and an air of cool superiority that Thomas never trusted. Though he tried to be kind, Margaret did too, hosting dinners, arranging flowers, dressing her best. Claire always came late and left early, complaining that the food was too heavy or the topics too dull, always with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thomas would shake his head after she left, saying she had ice in her veins, and Margaret would hush him, saying, "Give her time, she's young, she's nervous." She'd come around, but she never did. Instead, she pulled Daniel further away, whispering in his ear that his parents were simple people with simple minds, that their lives were too quiet, their ways too old, and Daniel changed with her until the boy who once begged to sleep on the couch with his dad during storms, now barely called once a month, and when he did, it was hurried, clipped as though counting the seconds until he could hang up and return to something more important. Thomas bore it quietly, pretending not to notice the absence, not to wince when Father's Day went by without a call, or when their anniversary was met with a generic card, but Margaret saw it all, the way his eyes scanned the mailbox, the way he still wore the watch Daniel gave him for his graduation. Even though the strap was cracked, the love was still there, unspoken but heavy like an anchor. And in the final year, when Thomas's health began to falter, when his hands shook and his breath grew short, he asked Margaret, "Once, do you think he'll come if I go?" And she lied. She said, "Of course he will. He's your son, he'll be here." But in her heart she feared the truth, feared what Claire had done to him, feared what Daniel had let happen, feared that Thomas might close his eyes one last time and never see his son again. And in the weeks before his death, Thomas tried twice to call Daniel, left voicemails filled with awkward pauses and soft sighs, saying things like, "Just checking in and hope all's well and I miss you, son," but the calls were never returned, and Margaret remembers the pain in his face more than the sickness, more than the medication or the hospice bed or the oxygen tank. It was the silence from his only child that broke him faster than any disease. And when the end finally came, Thomas went quietly, holding Margaret's hand, whispering "love you" under his breath, not knowing if Daniel even knew he was fading. And as Margaret sat beside him, she wondered where They went wrong, wondered if love was enough, wondered if blood really meant anything to the world. Daniel and Claire lived in where time was money and funerals were trivial events not worth attending, and even now, weeks after the funeral, that emptiness lingers. Thick in the house in the chair Thomas used to sit in during breakfast, and the smell of his cologne still clinging to his jacket, and in the untouched phone lying. The days after the funeral pass in a blur of cold tea and unopened sympathy cards and silence, the kind that fills a house and wraps around the walls like vines, slowly choking out the warmth, and Margaret sits in her late husband's armchair with the old photo album on her lap, pages crinkling under her fingers as she traces the fading faces of the life she once had, a life that felt whole despite its flaws and now feels shattered and unfinished and missing something she cannot replace. Not with flowers, not with prayer, not even with memory, and still the emptiness echoes in her heart because she cannot understand how a son could vanish from his father's death, how a man raised in love could abandon the man who taught him how to walk, how to swim, how to ride a bike, how to shake a hand and speak with kindness, and now all of that feels like a distant story someone told her long ago because the boy who laughed in these photographs has grown into someone she barely knows. Someone who speaks in clipped sentences and sharp conclusions, and so she gathers her strength with fingers shaking and grief still clinging to her spine, and she dials Daniel's number one more time, one last time, not knowing what she wants to hear or what she needs to say, only knowing that the silence between them has grown too wide and too cold, and when he answers, the sound of his voice is flat, disinterested, like someone picking up a call from a telemarketer and not his own mother. And she says his name, and he says, "Yeah, Mom, I'm busy," and she swallows the lump in her throat and says, "I wanted to ask why you didn't come," and there's a pause, a dangerous pause, and then he sighs like she's asked him something trivial, like she's burdened him with something that wasn't worth asking, and he says, "I told you. Claire and I don't really believe in that stuff anymore. Funerals are for people who want to perform grief, not feel it. We're not into outdated rituals, and besides, it's not like Dad and I were close, you know that," and she sits there holding the phone like it's burning through her hand, and for a moment she cannot speak because the weight of his words crushes something fragile inside her, something she didn't know was still alive, and she says quietly, "But he was your father," and Daniel replies, "He was your husband, not mine." And Claire said it best, it was a trivial event not worth attending, and Margaret wants to scream, wants to throw the phone across the room, wants to shake him through the screen and remind him of everything, remind him of the man who worked night shifts to pay for his college, who drove through a snowstorm to pick him up when he had a flat tire, who sat up all night worrying when he didn't call, who told everyone who would listen that his son was going to change the world, and now that same son speaks of his father like a footnote, like a disposable memory, like something that should have been buried without acknowledgement. And when she tries to speak again, Daniel says, "Look, I have to go. We're flying to Tokyo tomorrow. Claire has meetings and I need to prep, so let's just talk later, okay?" And the line goes dead before she can answer, before she can breathe, before she can decide if she ever wants to speak to him again, and she sits there alone again with her pain and her photo albums and the silence that Daniel has left in his place, and she wonders how something so full of love turned so cold, so empty, so far beyond repair, and she wishes she could go back to the day Claire entered their lives and tell Thomas to run, tell him that not every beautiful thing brings light, because some beauty only masks the frost underneath, and now that frost is in her son's heart, and she doesn't know if it will ever melt, and the last thing she hears in her head before falling into an exhausted Margaret spends her mornings now in near silence. The house groans softly around her as though mourning too, and she moves through the rooms as if she is only half present, her fingers brushing along the edges of old furniture and picture frames, like she's searching for some remaining trace of Thomas. And on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while sorting through a box of his belongings, she finds a small envelope tucked between the pages of a worn, leather-bound journal, the handwriting on it unmistakable, careful, steady, and unmistakably his. Addressed simply to Daniel, not posted, not sealed, as though Thomas never had the courage to send it, or perhaps never found the right time, and her heart stumbles when she sees it, as if touching something sacred, something still alive, and she holds it in her lap for minutes, maybe hours, unable to open it, unable to move until the weight of it becomes too much, and she gently unfolds the letter with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words as they spill out like a soft voice from beyond. "I know we've grown apart," it begins, and Margaret feels her breath catch in her throat. "I know I may not have been the father you wanted, but I always tried to be the father you needed. I see now how much we changed, how life and time and maybe my own quiet ways built a wall between us, and I don't blame you for that. I don't blame you for any of it, and I just want you to know that I am proud of the man you've become, no matter how far you've gone from here, and I hope one day you'll think of me not just as the man in your childhood photos, but as someone who loved you deeply even when I didn't say it enough. And Margaret can barely read the rest because her tears have blurred the ink, and she presses the paper to her chest as if she can still feel the echo of Thomas's heartbeat in the words, and in that moment she knows she has to send it, even though Daniel's absence at the funeral still stings like salt in an open wound, and even though his words over the phone still ring cruel and cold. She believes with a desperation that frightens her that maybe, just maybe, this letter can do what time and distance and even death could. Not that maybe it can reach whatever is left of her son's heart and remind him of who he was before all of this, before Claire, before the disconnection, before the silence. And she sits at her old kitchen table, writes a short note, slips it in with Thomas's letter, and places it in an envelope addressed to the high-rise apartment she's never seen but imagines is filled with glass and chrome and things too expensive to be meaningful. And she walks to the mailbox under a gray sky that presses down on her shoulders and lets the letter fall through the slot, and she walks home slowly, her heart aching, not with hope, but with longing, not expecting a reply, not expecting healing, but simply needing to give this last piece of Thomas to the son who chose not to say goodbye. And that night, she dreams of Thomas in his favorite chair reading the newspaper as sunlight spills across the room, and Daniel as a boy sitting on the floor, at his feet, building castles out of blocks and asking questions about the world, and Thomas answering every one with patience and love. And when she wakes, the house feels quieter than ever, but something inside her is the days stretch out like winter shadows, long and cold and unmoving, and Margaret finds herself watching the mailbox every morning as if something sacred might arrive in the shape of a reply, something that might close the space that grief has carved into her chest, something that might feel like forgiveness or understanding, or even the soft edge of regret. And yet each day brings only the usual clutter, flyers and bills and envelopes with names that do not matter. And still she watches. Still she waits, her eyes tracing the sidewalk from the front window, hoping perhaps that Daniel will appear in person unannounced, as if he has suddenly remembered how to be her son, but he does not, and the silence becomes its own kind of answer. Until one morning a message arrives, not a letter but an email, plain, unadorned, sitting like a ghost in her inbox. From Daniel's subject line, none. The preview showing only 3 words, I got it. And her hands hesitate above the keyboard because she is afraid that opening it will crush the last ember of hope she has left, but she does it anyway, and inside the message is short, too carefully composed to be spontaneous, and yet not polished enough to be impersonal, and it reads, I got the letter. I didn't know Dad still thought about me like that. I need time to think. Claire and I are figuring things out, and that's all. And she reads it again and again until the words lose shape and meaning and become only feeling, only confusion, only noise. And in those vague and broken sentences, she senses something that might be remorse, or might be guilt, or might be nothing at all. And she sits with it for hours, replaying each phrase in her mind, trying to find the man who used to be her little boy, the one who cried when his dog died, the one who begged for bedtime stories, the one who hugged his father tight when he came home from work. And she wonders what Claire and I are figuring things out could possibly mean, and whether Claire even knows about the letter, or if this sudden shift is coming from Daniel alone, and if so, what changed, what cracked, what allowed her husband's quiet final words to reach him across time and silence and pride. And Margaret does not reply to the email, not at first, because she knows now that some things cannot be rushed, and if Daniel truly wants to find his way back, he will do so, not because of obligation or pressure or guilt, but because something inside him finally understands what he walked away from and what it cost him. And the weeks go on and no new messages come, and she tells herself to be patient, tells herself that healing is not linear, that grief moves like water, retreating and surging and soaking through everything in its path. And on one particularly quiet night, she lights a candle beside Thomas's photo, the one where he is smiling with his arm around Daniel on the boys' graduation day, both of them sunburned and happy and unaware of how distant they would become. And she whispers into the empty room, he heard you, Tom. He read your words, and maybe, just maybe, he's still listening. And though the emptiness in the house is still vast, still heavy, still sharp in the morning light, something feels ever so slightly different, no louder than the whisper of wind through curtains or the hush of breath in sleep. The sky is pale and wide on the morning of what would have been Thomas's 70th birthday, and Margaret wakes before the sun with her hands folded across her chest, and the echo of dreams still lingering in her mind, dreams of laughter and clinking glasses and a backyard filled with light, the kind of memory that hurts more the longer you hold it. And she rises slowly, her knees stiff, her back aching but her spirit steady, because today she has chosen to remember, not the pain, not the absence, not the silence, but the man she loved and the life they built together, and she prepares the house for a quiet gathering, just a few neighbors and old friends who still speak his name with warmth, and she bakes his favorite lemon cake and sets his photo on the table surrounded by garden flowers just the way he used to cut them before breakfast in a jar, because he always said vases were too fancy, and she lights the candle beside it and breathes in deep the scent of wax and sugar and sunlight streaming through the windows, and she tells herself that she will be okay, that she has survived this far and will keep going with or without her son. And just as the clock strikes 3 and the first guest knocks on the door, Margaret hears the sound of tires on gravel and turns slowly to the window and sees a figure stepping out of a car. Not Claire, not anyone from town, but Daniel, and he looks older than she remembers, not just in years, but in weight and posture and in the way his shoulders slump and his eyes search the ground before finding her face through the glass, and they do not smile, not yet, but something shifts in the air, something old and forgotten begins to stir. And he walks up the path slowly, like he's afraid the ground might break beneath him, and when she opens the door, neither of them speaks for a long moment, and then he says in a voice smaller than she's ever heard, "I came alone," and she nods, her eyes filling with something that isn't quite forgiveness but isn't quite anger either, and she steps aside and he walks in and looks around at the familiar rooms, the familiar scent, the small details of a home that still remembers him even if he tried to forget it, and they sit together in the living room on opposite ends of the couch, and he looks at the photo of his father and says, "I didn't know he wrote that letter until it was too late, and I don't know what I'm supposed to say." And Margaret looks at him and says, "Sometimes there's nothing to say, just things to feel and moments to show up for." And he nods and looks away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched like someone holding on to something fragile, and she wants to reach for him, but she waits, and after a while he says, "Claire, and I separated last month, and I don't know if it's for good, and I don't know who I am without her voice in my head. And I think I started believing her too much about who you were, about who I was, about what mattered, and I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't know how to come back." And Margaret listens, and she hears the sorrow in his voice, the kind that isn't loud, but deep and lingering. And she realizes this is the closest he has come to saying, "I'm sorry," and it will have to be enough for now. And she stands and walks to the kitchen and cuts 2 slices of cake and returns with plates and hands him one without a word, and he takes it like an offering, and they eat in silence, the kind of silence that no longer hurts but heals. And when the last guest leaves and the sun begins to dip below the trees, casting the living room in gold, Daniel stands and says, "I'll come again if that's okay." And Margaret nods and says, "It's okay." And when he opens the door to leave, he hesitates, then turns and says, "I think Dad would have liked this." And she says softly, "He would have loved it." And then he walks down the path slowly, like someone learning to walk again, and she watches him disappear down the street. And though the ache in her chest still lingers, she knows something has shifted, not in a grand way, not in a way that erases the past, but in the quiet, steady way of seeds beginning to root after a long winter. And she closes the door and returns to the photo and the candle and whispers, "We're going to be all right, Tom, maybe not the way we hoped, but maybe in a way that still matters."